Good evening and welcome. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies and Grand Valley's Political Science Department, thank you for joining us for our 2020 election panel, or more fittingly, the pregame show for the final presidential debate. My name is Jacob Agard, and I'm the program manager of the Common Ground Initiative in the Hauenstein Center. To quote our former director, Gleaves Whitney, at the Hauenstein Center, we believe we have a mission to raise the level of discourse about this election. Indeed, all of the discourse in our public square. Those words could not ring truer in 2020, as we find ourselves just 12 days away from the presidential election. In our Common Ground Initiative, we engage in substantial conversations about our nation's complicated histories and shifting realities, as well as the political coalitions and ideas that define our civic life in the United States today. By casting a critical light on the differences among various political camps in our public square, we can illuminate the areas of shared commitment that must exist for our republic to accommodate and benefit from the collision of our progressive and conservative elements. That's what the Common Ground Initiative is all about. Tonight, we shift away from the 24-hour news cycle and horse race of the campaign. Instead, we will focus on the significant issues facing our nation and address areas of potential common ground. Our format for the evening will begin with a leadership minute from one of our fellow candidates in the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy, followed by introductions by the moderator and opening remarks from each panelist. The discussion will last between 45 and 60 minutes, with questions being answered throughout and at the end. So, as a question comes to mind, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar to submit your questions. We will go no longer than 8:30 p.m. As we look to November 3rd and beyond, we must keep the hope of our democracy alive and pass the torch to the next generation of leaders. I will end by giving you all a taste of that hope for the future in the form of a leadership minute. I would like to now introduce Samuel Jacobs, a junior studying public administration, political science, and criminal justice. This is Samuel's first year in the Leadership Academy, and you can often find him somewhere on Grand Valley's campus urging young people to get involved. Take it away, Samuel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samuel Jacobs, and I am a Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate. One of the most important ways to make a difference is to be a leader. This is one of the main reasons I applied to CLA. I want to learn how to make the most impactful and positive change I can, no matter what community I am in. In times like these, the importance of not just good, but great leadership cannot be understated. On that note, one of the other main ways to make a difference in your community is by voting. In my time at GV, I have helped lead voter registration efforts across the GV community. Voting is not only our voice, but it is both the purpose and test of democracy. It is our civic duty to vote, and it is our ethical responsibility to be a voice for the voiceless. A great Margaret Mead quote comes to mind with the importance of voting and positive change. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. As leaders, it is our obligation to engage our communities to make a positive change for not just now, but for the future. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel, Darren Walhof. Professor Walhof is the chair of the Political Science Department here at Grand Valley. Take it away, Darren.
Thank you, Sam. And thanks to the Hauenstein Center and to Jacob and Allie for hosting this panel and including it among Hauenstein's always strong lineup of events that seek to shed light on politics and history. I'm hoping we can do that tonight as well in a political moment where there is certainly plenty of heat, but not always that much light. I'm very pleased that we have a stellar panel of experts to talk about the election this evening, and I'm going to start by briefly introducing them to you. Matt McLogan is Vice President at Grand Valley State University, where he supervises communications, marketing, public relations, broadcasting, and government relations. Matt is a former journalist specializing in politics and elections, and the former news director at Wood TV, where he covered Gerald Ford's rise from Congress to vice president to president. Matt has also served as a public commissioner on the Michigan Public Service Commission, the state's widest ranging regulatory agency. Polly Diven is Professor of Political Science at GVSU and Director of the International Relations Program. She received her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she teaches international relations, US foreign policy, and a course on great decisions in conjunction with the World Affairs Council annual lecture. Her research is on US foreign policy with a particular interest in the influence of domestic interest groups on foreign policy. Patrick Miles is an attorney in the Grand Rapids office of Barnes and Thornburg. He's a proud Grand Rapids native and a graduate of the Grand Rapids Public Schools, Aquinas College, and Harvard Law School. Pat was the Democratic nominee for the 3rd Congressional District in 2010 against Representative Justin Amash. And from 2012 until January 20, 2017, Pat served as the presidentially appointed U.S. Attorney for Michigan's Western District, which covers 49 of Michigan's 83 counties. Michelle Miller-Adams has a PhD from Columbia University and is Professor of Political Science at GVSU, and also senior researcher at the Upjohn Institute in Kalamazoo. She teaches courses on social and economic policy and international relations, and she publishes widely on place-based scholarship programs, including the Kalamazoo Promise. Michelle has a new book coming out this spring with Harvard Education Press called The Path to Free College: In Pursuit of Access, Equity, and Prosperity. Welcome to all of you. I've asked each member of our panel to begin by offering their expert insights on the election. After each of them has given their remarks, I will ask them to address questions from those of you who have tuned in. You may direct your question to a particular panelist or to the panel in general. So let's begin our discussion with remarks from Matt McLogan. Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you very much, Darren. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining this evening. This is the 3rd time in a row I've had an opportunity as an armchair political junkie to be with the Hauenstein Center's guests, and thank you for this opportunity one more time. But as we begin tonight, there is one person I want to recognize who would absolutely have been in the audience and listening, and that is Peter Secchia, who has, as we now know, left the scene. And Peter and Joan are underwriters with others who are supporting tonight's Hauenstein Center event. And I just want to acknowledge their philanthropy that helps the Hauenstein Center do programs such as this. Also, my comments tonight are my own only and do not reflect the views of Grand Valley State University. So 4 years ago next week, we were all witnessing the end of the presidential campaign and discovered that both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were headed to Michigan. Hillary Clinton conducted her last solo campaign appearance of on the campus of Grand Valley State University in Allendale. Donald Trump was in Grand Rapids and that night took over the Grand Center downtown. It was the first time any real attention had been paid to Grand Rapids or Michigan as part of the presidential campaign, because we had been a flyover state. While there was sporadic television advertising, the campaign was really not much in evidence here until the 2 candidates appeared. Clearly, their campaigns knew that Michigan might be flippable. And as it turned out, it was. But what set that up? Why did they come here? Well, from 1972 through 1992, Republican candidates for president carried Michigan in every single election, uninterrupted for 20 years. From 1992 through 2012, Democrats carried every presidential election in Michigan. So as part of the so-called blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, didn't look like Michigan was going to be gettable or in play. But something happened in Michigan in 2016 that had not happened in other years, in either one of those 4 decades that I just mentioned. And Donald Trump carried Michigan by 0.3% when all the votes had been counted. So why did he win and Hillary Clinton lose? 311,000 Michigan citizens voted for third-party candidate in 2016. That's 6% of the total vote. 87,810, I've got that number exact, went to the polls, voted for somebody in the 2016 election, but did not vote for president, left the line blank. In Wayne County, 14% fewer voters showed up to vote in 2016 as compared to 2012. Those kinds of anomalies reduced the amount that was necessary for either candidate to carry the state. And Donald Trump got 47% of the vote. But for the 20 years that Republicans were losing votes in Michigan, their average take of the vote in losing was 46.5%, almost exactly the number that Donald Trump got and was able to win with. So you, I think, need to ask yourself, if you're looking at 2020, are the circumstances that led to the reduction in vote likely to repeat, or will the third-party candidates draw less? And Morning Consult, an outfit that follows data and carefully, put out a poll this morning, the results of which were very interesting. They went after voters who were third-party voters in 2016 to ask their attitudes about 2020 and whether they would vote for a Republican or a Democrat instead of the third-party candidates they had voted for 4 years ago. 50% of them said they are not going to vote for a third-party candidate, but they're going to vote for Vice President Biden. So Donald Trump is looking for a pathway to get to 270 electoral votes. And clearly Michigan is in his radar because the advertising and the appearance by candidates, members of the administration, from the president and the vice president, cabinet members, has been substantial. But one pathway that the Trump campaign is apparently carefully considering is whether it can reach a tie in the Electoral College and throw the election into the House of Representatives if there is no winner when all the votes are counted. That's something that takes less than 270 electoral votes. If you hit 269 on top or less, then the election goes to the House. It's only happened once in our history. Twice in our history, first with Thomas Jefferson and second with John Quincy Adams in 1824. What would it take? A certain combination of states, or the circumstance in which a faithless elector in one or more states produces a number less than 270. So why would Michigan find that to be particularly interesting? Right now, in our congressional delegation, we get 16 electoral votes, 2 senators, 14 members of Congress. They are divided 7 Democrats, 6 Republicans, and 1 Libertarian, the congressman from Grand Rapids, Justin Amash. So what will that number look like after the election in 2 weeks? Will the Democrats pick up a seat in Michigan, making it 8-6? Will the Republicans pick up a seat, making it 8-6, in which case Michigan's 1 vote will go for the majority party that's controlling the Michigan delegation. But what happens if it's divided 7-7? Because each state only gets 1 vote, we do not know how that would get bargained or whether someone would leave their partisan designation to produce the majority that's necessary to have Michigan's 1 vote. Finally, while you're thinking about that, the Senate elects the Vice President of the United States, and presumably that person would be chosen by voting the party of each senator. So if there are 51 Republicans, they could elect Mike Pence to be the Vice President of the United States if the House chooses Joe Biden. The reverse could also be true. If Donald Trump somehow became the contingent winner in the House and the Senate was controlled by Democrats, his vice president would be Kamala Harris. So lots of moving pieces in this puzzle. Michigan remains in play. It seems clear that President Trump cannot be reelected without carrying Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, or at least some combination that equals those electoral votes. So my best advice is stay tuned.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Matt. Now let's turn to Polly Diven. Polly, you're on.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you again for having me. I think this is really an exciting opportunity to share some of my analysis of the foreign policy in the election. So as someone who studies foreign policy, and especially the domestic politics of foreign policy, I have to admit that this time of year, every 4 years, makes me a little crazy because we aren't usually talking about foreign policy. And again, we aren't really this year. And the reality is that who we elect to be the president will really have a large impact on our foreign policy. The president in the United States system has always had foreign policy power, and that power has grown over time. So the president is the commander in chief who can move troops, and Congress doesn't seem to challenge him on that very much. He can grant recognition to countries, open and close and move embassies, like in Israel. He has the power, obviously, to appoint cabinet posts and ambassadors, and the power to make and break executive agreements, and those are done a lot more than treaties these days. So, and above all that, of course, the symbolic singularity of being the president means that he's the head of state and the head of government. So when the president speaks, people listen. So my frustration comes from the fact that people don't usually pay attention much to foreign policy every 4 years or at all. And yet the president can cause massive changes to US foreign policy. So, first of all, I think I want to encourage people to think about that and to use their analysis of foreign policy experience and as a basis for their selection of the president. So this election cycle, we haven't really heard much about North Korea or terrorism or Syria or any number of subjects that probably should be discussed a lot more. But of course, the COVID pandemic and its economic impact have dominated the news cycle. But I just want people to remember that elections have important foreign policy consequences. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the foreign policy platforms of the two presidents. And really what we can do is look at what President Trump's foreign policy record and experience have been over the past 4 years versus, really just what Vice President Biden has said and written on his campaign page. So I want to start with President Trump. And I want to note that, first of all, he has not been a typical president when it comes to foreign policy making. This phrase has been used about him by Richard Haas in the Atlantic and in other places. He's been a foreign policy disruptor. And by that, we mean he's changed the way we conduct foreign policy, the way we talk to foreign leaders, and the way we work with our allies overseas or don't work with them overseas. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe some people who elected him wanted that, and that's why they elected him, right? To make America great again, to pursue this kind of neo-isolationist path and to put America first. But clearly he has engaged in a lot of the kind of disrupting of the traditional in foreign policy. And whether a voter sees this as a good or a bad thing can vary. The last 4 presidents before President Trump, that's 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, probably all had much more in common among the 4 of them than any of them has with President Trump and his conduct of foreign policy. And let me just give you some examples of this. He's rather undiplomatic. He doesn't seem to use the kind of diplomatic or professional language of other presidents, right? He says Angela Merkel's ruining Germany to her face and doesn't shake her hand at a White House meeting. He calls Kim Jong-un Rocket Man, and he refers to African countries in words I won't even say here, but like blank hole countries. So, you know, really a very different kind of president. Starting from the beginning, he won't, even before he's inaugurated, he doesn't accept the daily briefings offered by policy advisors from state and from the CIA. And then he begins with the implementation of this pretty, isolationist foreign policy, removing us from a number of diplomatic agreements. Some of them we're not surprised about, right? Because he said he would do that. He promised to do that, and his supporters wanted to do that. Remove us from the Iran nuclear agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Accord. But I think other people were surprised that, for example, he decided we're no longer going to be part of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty, or more recently, removing us from the World Health Organization. That's pretty shocking stuff and not typical for a president to do. So I think that's a really important point. Another thing I think is very important to think about with regard to President Trump, and this is not so unusual compared to other presidents, is that for him, foreign policy is domestic policy, right? I mean, so much of what he's done has been about trying to address the needs of his domestic political base. He's been talking about, suggesting that if we can remove ourselves from overseas engagement, if we can get tough with our allies and make them pay more for NATO or whatever, that's the get tough approach that will make his base happy. I mean, he really successfully has created a scapegoat in China and in Mexico and can blame them. He blames them for some of our economic woes. And I think that that's been about domestic policy more than foreign policy. I think it's really hard to point out like that there's a coherent foreign policy except, to address the needs of a domestic base and to kind of disrupt what's been going on. I do want to point out another element of the Trump foreign policy, and that has been very personalized, right? To sort of get to know a person. He thinks if he gets in the room with Putin or if he gets in the room with Kim Jong-un, he can solve a really major foreign policy rift. And so he has sort of engaged some pretty surprising autocratic leaders over the last 4 years, including Erdogan of Turkey and Duterte from the Philippines, in ways that other presidents haven't done. And in some cases, in fact, with Russia, I think in particular, he's been found, praising foreign leaders or actually criticizing his own, domestic political organizations or foreign policy organizations. There's the now famous, I guess, July 2018 briefing with Putin, when the president, publicly criticizes reports from the US intelligence agencies and refuses to hold Putin accountable for documented attempts to interfere with US elections. So this is a really interesting approach to foreign policy where you're less likely to be praising your own intelligence organizations and to be kind of minimizing the input of the State Department in making foreign policy. Of course, a large number of his advisors have then resigned or left the office because of disagreements over foreign policy. Some of them were quite were excused. I mean, Rex Tillerson, the first Secretary of State under President Trump, was fired in a tweet. And then we have someone like General Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, the first Secretary of Defense, who has left over a disagreement over President Trump's policy to withdraw from northern Syria. We also see that with the resignation of Dan Coats from the National Security Administration and National Security Advisor John Bolton as well. Now, we need to contrast this a little bit with what would Biden's foreign policy be, and we don't really know that. I can only suggest that probably it's a return to more of what we saw in the Obama era, more multilateral engagement. In fact, when I went to his platform on the website, I saw the following objectives, and I think some of them were kind of really addressing differences with Trump. I mean, the difference couldn't be more stark. It's a really clear choice. Vice President Biden says his foreign policy platform includes restoring dignified leadership at home, elevating diplomacy, restoring partnerships with our allies, rallying the world to address the existential climate crisis. Now, that's a very big difference of opinion between the president and the vice president. And then terminating the travel ban against Muslim majority countries and raising our target for refugee admissions to a new level. So that's a very different approach as well. So I just want to finish by saying one, quick reminder that presidents have a lot of foreign policy power, and it's important to think about that when we vote. I don't expect that there's going to be a lot of attention paid to foreign policy in the next 2 weeks. There hasn't been, and there probably won't be, but it's important to recognize that elections have consequences, and they really have consequences for foreign policy. That's it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Polly. Now on to Pat Miles. Pat, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. It's really good to be with everyone here this evening. I appreciate this opportunity and, of course, the work of the Hauenstein Center. And my comments, of course, do not reflect those of my law firm. We have over 700, almost 700 lawyers nationwide. So I'm speaking for just myself here tonight. But I really feel like we are at a crossroads as a nation. This is probably the most consequential election in my lifetime. And we are certainly facing some very severe issues that are immediate. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, which is ravaging the world, and it's really ravaging the United States in terms of the number of infections and cases, and of course deaths, which are presently increasing in many states, in a majority of our states. We right now have a bad economy. After seeing over the past 5 to 10 years, steady GDP growth quarter to quarter of around 2.5 to 3.5%, and then since 2010, the annual GDP growth was fairly low. It was at around 2%, and with an annual high of 3.1% in 2015, and then again got to 3% in 2019. In quarter one of this year, 2020, it was negative 5%. And then in quarter two, it was negative 30%. And those are the first negative quarters in GDP in many years. Unemployment, which had been trending down steadily since late 2009, and was about, from in 2016, it was 10% in 2009 and down to 4.5% in 2016, and it's been holding at around 4%, so a little less than that last year. It's now shot up. It shot up during the onset of the COVID pandemic and the shutdowns and so forth to over 15%. It's been going down since then, but it's still around 8%, which is again, is very historically high that we've seen. Race relations right now are very poor. We are seeing a rise of a lot of open white nationalism and white supremacy and neo-Nazi type groups. We're seeing a lot of mistrust in communities of color against local law enforcement. We also, as we just heard yesterday, we're seeing a number of foreign cyber threats. And when I was the United States Attorney, we saw a number of those during that period where foreign governments and foreign bad actors were trying to penetrate our critical infrastructure in the United States, and also to try and penetrate private corporate infrastructure so that they could steal intellectual property and other things from those companies. But we're seeing that now, and also trying to affect and disrupt our election. And I'll speak a little bit about that later. And so we've also, in Michigan, we've obviously seen a domestic terror plot by right-wing extremists to kidnap our governor, put her on trial for treason, to attack other state officials and law enforcement, and harm many people. And we, unfortunately, have a president who's been encouraging a lot of vigilantism in terms of groups. against what he sees as threats, like Antifa and others. So that's really troubling. And I'm not one, for people who know me and have seen me, they know that I'm not one for hyperbole. I'm considered to be a pragmatic idealist. I have my ideals, but I'm pragmatic about trying to achieve those. I always try and seek consensus wherever that's possible. I love solving problems, and more importantly, I like to put the country over political party and believe that is just absolutely necessary in our elected officials. But unfortunately, in this generation, over the past few decades, we've seen what I consider to be a generation of political selfishness, of people putting their own personal power and their pursuit of power over the public interest, and not focusing on the problems of the people, and certainly not solving them. And that's caused a lot of alienation and dissatisfaction by a large swath of our American electorate. Also, what we're seeing recently are what I consider to be long-term damage to many of our American democratic institutions. We've seen attacks on our media, the so-called fourth branch, which is obviously very important. It's mentioned in the First Amendment to the Constitution. I'm going to call out right now Fox News. I think since the late 1990s, when it was launched, it's been essentially a partisan, a Republican Party talking point and propaganda arm. They hated President Clinton, never criticized President George W. Bush, opposed President Obama at every turn, called him names. They certainly promoted Donald Trump during his 2016 campaign. Since then, they've still been supporting Trump on a number of things as president, but you're starting even to see now them present some balanced reporting on some of his statements and activities. With my old stomping grounds, the U.S. Department of Justice, which when I was there, I was always impressed by all of the career prosecutors and other people who worked in the U.S. Attorney's offices and at the main Justice Department in Washington, D.C., that they were nonpartisan. Nobody expressed their personal political beliefs at the office, on the job, saw no evidence of any bias in decisions that were being made, whether on prosecutions and others. We called them like we saw them. And we were and the people's lawyer, loyal to the Constitution. In fact, President Obama told one of his gatherings of U.S. attorneys, his presidentially appointed U.S. attorneys, specifically, "You are not my lawyer. You are the lawyer for the people, and you should be loyal to the Constitution first and foremost." He said that. He felt that very strongly. We've seen exactly the opposite from President Trump. He demands loyalty to him personally. He has very much, in my mind, done a lot of damage to that institution, the Department of Justice, of being considered to be a fair and impartial dispenser of justice. And Americans must trust in the impartiality of the Department of Justice. I was pleased at the beginning of this administration that the U.S. Attorney's offices were calling them like they see them. They were prosecuting people, particularly in the Southern District of New York and in the Washington, D.C. office, people who had access to this administration, who had been in it, who were personal friends of the president. They were bringing those cases, they were prosecuting them. But then since then, we've seen Attorney General Barr intervene in a number of those cases, overriding essentially the decisions of the local prosecutors in those U.S. attorney offices. In the case of Michael Flynn, in the case of Paul Manafort, in the case of Roger Stone. Again, very inappropriate, very unprecedented for the Department of Justice. We've even seen the Department of Justice under Attorney General Barr intervene in a civil defamation lawsuit by an alleged rape victim, E. Jean Carroll, against President Trump, essentially acting like his defense lawyer. And that is, again, unprecedented, and I think can do lasting harm to that institution of the Department of Justice. We've seen attacks on the legitimacy of our elections, not just from Iran and Russia, as we learned yesterday, but also from President Trump, and calling those into question, not conceding that he would grant a peaceful transfer of power if, in his own opinion, he decides that it was not a fair election. I will talk more about election fraud and voter fraud later, and how rare that truly is. I think that I have a lot of Republican friends who just don't have a home right now. They're certainly not going to vote for President Trump. They're probably going to vote for Joe Biden for president, but they feel very lost. And I think that President Trump has been doing a lot of damage to that party, as well as to the candidates who are running for office right now under that banner, whether it's for the Senate or the House of Representatives. There is no agenda for the second term of how they're going to improve people's lives, make the lives better for grandparents and parents and children, whether it's on health care or preserving Social Security and strengthening it, on employment, on education, and making access to education better and more affordable. What has been the president's 2020 election theme? It's been his grievances against individual reporters. Now it's against Dr. Fauci. He's even calling out his own Attorney General Barr, who's been doing his bidding, and he's even unhappy with him right now because he won't bring criminal, or at least announce criminal investigations and indictments against his political foes, which again, the DOJ had a long-standing policy that when you're in the window of an election, you really did not want to announce those types of investigations or bring those types of cases for fear of influencing the election outcome. That was a standard operating procedure for the Department of Justice. He's running on a campaign of fear against a progressive agenda, such as the Green New Deal and fracking and anti-fracking and so forth. And he's bringing up allegations against Vice President Biden's son, Hunter. None of that has anything to do with making individual Americans' lives better. And that for a president running for re-election, especially during challenging times like we have today with the pandemic and the economy and so forth, I don't see how that's a winning formula. When President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for re-election in the 30s during the Great Depression, he at least had shown Americans that he was taking their concerns and considerations seriously. He was making efforts to make their lives better and taking affirmative steps to try and turn that economic situation around. We're just not seeing that, especially with the COVID pandemic. We're not seeing any firm steps and outline of a plan from the president to eliminate this pandemic. And so I think that the choice is pretty clear, it's pretty stark, but it also, like I say, we're at a crossroads as Americans of which direction do we want to go and who do we want to be. In terms of the elections, since voter fraud is extraordinarily rare. In 2012, the Carnegie and Knight Foundation funded a study by journalism students, and it found that since the year 2000 until 2012, over 600 million votes were cast in the United States. Out of those, there were only a little over 2,000 cases of election fraud, which is 0.000003%. And out of those, only 633 involved voter fraud, someone trying to vote, maybe impersonating, another voter or doing something that involved voter fraud. That's 0.00001%. And of those 633 voter fraud cases, only 10 were cases of in-person voter fraud or impersonation that were alleged. And even the Heritage Foundation found that since 1998, there were only 14 cases of attempted mail fraud voting out of 15.5 million ballots cast. So it's extremely rare to have voter fraud. There's very little incentive for individuals to risk election violation penalties versus a group trying to do so on a large scale. And even then, a group trying to do voter fraud on a large scale is very difficult because each county in America has a different ballot because they have different races, local races for sheriff and judges and so forth, and for state representatives and county commission and the like. And there are over 3,000 counties in the United States. So to conduct a large-scale fraud, you'd have to print ballots of 3 different types of versions. So it's extremely rare. I also think voter participation is obviously a problem. And we just have too low voter participation in the United States. It was only about 55.5% in the United States. Matt McLogan mentioned some of these numbers as well from Michigan in 2016. And so these attacks on our election process, I think, are extremely damaging to our American Republic. So again, in sum, I think we are at a crossroads as a country of what direction we want to go, who we want to be as Americans. Can we be unified again as Americans? And out of e pluribus unum, out of many one, and working together rather than working against each other. And we are under threats from foreigners foreign governments who want to disrupt these institutions and disrupt our democracy. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pat. Now, Michelle Miller-Adams. Michelle?
Hi, I'm really happy to be here tonight and happy that the Political Science Department and the Hauenstein Center are collaborating on this event. I really appreciate all of you who are here listening in. There's some great questions in the chat, so I want to make sure we get to those. So I'll keep things as brief as I can. I wanted to focus tonight on the economy and especially the connection between higher education and a vibrant US workforce. This is a topic that's received almost no attention throughout the election season. To the extent that economic policy issues have been discussed, the focus has been on the political conflict over a renewed stimulus and relief effort. And of course, it's really important that something be done in that area. It's important not just to individuals, but to local and state government, to small and large businesses, to K-12 school districts, and to higher ed institutions like our own. But there's a longer term story that's being missed. The pandemic will change the economy in fundamental and lasting ways. And it's already clear that some of the jobs that were lost will never return. Some industries, for example, healthcare or communications, will benefit from this reordering, while others, especially those subject to automation, are going to lose more. This kind of churn is always underway in the US economy, but these changes are happening exceedingly fast, and they especially disadvantage less skilled workers. Job seekers need to adjust, and they need to do so in a very different economic climate than the one they faced less than a year ago. Pat mentioned some of these statistics, but in February 2020, unemployment was at a historic low. It was 3.5%, the lowest rate since the 1950s. And businesses were desperately seeking skilled workers to fill job openings that were going unfilled. Just 2 months later, the labor market had completely reversed itself and unemployment was at an historic high of 15%. It's come down since then, but it still stands at 8%, which is more than 3 times as high as it was before the pandemic. In order to succeed in the post-pandemic economy, individuals need access to affordable post-secondary education and training. And as the economy recovers, business is going to need access to skilled workers. In the aftermath of the 2008 recession, research has shown that 99% of the jobs created required some kind of post-secondary education and training. And a lot of this was at the sub-BA level. So it included associate degrees, industry recognized certificates, and the other kinds of credentials that are largely offered by community colleges. And this is one factor that's been driving the explosion of the free college movement, probably more accurate to call it the tuition-free college movement, because no one is really proposing to pay all college costs. About 200 communities, including Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Detroit, and about 20 states have created some form of tuition-free access to community college, and sometimes more than that, for their residents. So what does this have to do with the current election? There's very little to say about the Republican Party's plans for expanding access to higher education. The party opted not to put forward a platform this year and pledged to continue doing what they've been doing. When it comes to higher education and meeting workforce needs, this means promoting for-profit colleges, most of which do very little good for the students they enroll, and offering tax breaks to businesses, which might help those businesses, but doesn't do much to help workers with occupational and social mobility. The Biden-Harris campaign, on the other hand, has offered quite detailed plans for higher education access, but these have received little attention in the firestorm and the horse race aspects of our current presidential campaign. There are 5 key elements to the Biden-Harris plan for higher education and workforce development. The first is tuition-free community college. And an important point about this is that it would be offered to students on what we call a first dollar basis, which means they would have access to that first. And then if they were eligible for Pell Grants, they could add those on top of this tuition-free college to cover some of their living expenses. This is a much more equitable way to structure a tuition-free community college program. A second component is investments in workforce training programs, including apprenticeships and business community college partnerships. A third part of the plan is to double the maximum value of the Pell Grant. A fourth component is to pass legislation to provide tuition-free access to public four-year colleges and universities like our own, as well as historically Black colleges and universities for families earning up to $125,000. And a fifth component is making reforms to federal student loan debt to make it easier to repay. So you might be asking yourself, is any of this politically realistic? So it's more realistic if the Democrats win back control of the Senate. But the first 3 items on the list, tuition-free community college, investment in workforce training programs, and doubling of the Pell Grant, are realistic even with a Republican Senate. Republicans in various parts of the nation have shown support for business-oriented free college programs. One of the best examples comes from Tennessee, which is a deeply red state and has passed enacted programs over the last 6 years that enable every recent high school graduate and adult without a college degree to attend community college tuition free. And many Republican legislators are big fans of the Pell Grant program. So there's definitely room for bipartisan work on this issue. And we need look no further than Michigan, where our Democratic governor and our Republican legislature have cooperated to enact 2 programs that expand access to higher education in the interest of a better prepared workforce. The first of those is Michigan Reconnect, which was just funded in the budget that passed quite recently. It provides tuition-free community college for adults in Michigan who don't have a college degree. A predecessor program enacted by the governor herself last year called Futures for Frontliners offered a similar opportunity, but only to essential workers. And it is a time-limited program for just a year, whereas Michigan Reconnect is designed to be an ongoing program. There was also something in the budget called the Going Pro Talent Fund, which gives money to employers to assist in training and retaining current and new employees. So under this program, employers get grants of $1,500 to $3,000 per employee for short-term training or apprenticeship programs. So these are both examples of the scope for bipartisan action around increasing access and reducing cost of higher education and tying it to the nation's workforce needs. A great deal remains to be done to position workers and businesses for success in a post-COVID economy. The good news is that some of the most effective strategies hold the potential for bipartisan action. The bad news is that very little has been accomplished during the first 4 years of the Trump administration, and media coverage of the current campaign has largely overlooked these issues. So I'm going to stop there and hope we can follow up on some of these points in the Q&A. So back to you, Darren.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Michelle. So now we're going to ask our panelists to address some questions. There's great questions that have come in from our audience, and you can feel free to continue sending in questions. I'm going to start with one directed to Polly Diven, but obviously others can jump in as well. And it's come up in a couple of questions, and it really has to do with what has been the effects of recent foreign policy of the Trump administration on U.S. standing in the world, and how might that change under a different administration?
I guess I'll just say, obviously, I think that it doesn't, well, let me say it this way. If the president is pursuing a foreign policy that is very oriented toward making America great again and isolation and being more about everything for us, it's obviously not going to impress the rest of the world. I don't think there's any question about that, that they would be put off by that kind of policy, but also the way in which the policy is made, the kind of lack of professionalism and so forth. I do think that people in other countries do distinguish between President Trump and America. And I think that's probably something that we could focus on. In 2020, the Pew Research Center did a poll of 13 countries. So this is South Korea, Italy, Japan, UK, Australia, Canada, Denmark, whatever, a bunch of countries, all in Asia and Europe. And they asked, what percent of these people have a favorable view of the United States and what percent have a favorable view of President Trump? And not surprisingly, I guess, the favorable view of the United States was 34% for our country and 16% for our president. So, whereas those are sort of sad numbers anyway, at least they're better for our country than for our current president. And I suspect that, if he's not reelected, then people are, well, this happened. We didn't like his approach. We changed the approach. Things get better again. We saw this when we went from President George W. Bush to President Obama, that we had a dip or an increase actually in anti-Americanism that then fell down again. And I think we could say the same thing. However, we could see the same thing happening again. However, if we reelect President Trump, I think then that changes things quite a bit, because it demonstrates that the American public has decided to keep up this kind of America first, isolationist foreign policy. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I'm going to turn now to Matt. There's a question, a really great question that was asked about how is it possible for student leaders on campus to start conversations about the election specifically, but I think more generally about politics in our country when everything seems so polarized in this polarized environment. So I'm gonna have Matt address that first, and then others can jump in on that too.
Earlier this afternoon, I was invited to a Zoom meeting with the members of the Grand Valley Student Senate. And what you are just asking about came up. Students were concerned that because of the polarization, that it just becomes uncomfortable to start conversations. So what I was told they've been talking about lately has been voting and participation, and not necessarily about the candidates themselves, which I take to be a good sign, because we know 18 to 25-year-olds, 26-year-olds are the demographic least likely to vote, even though they are potentially all brand new voters. So the Student Senate has been working closely with the Allendale Township Clerk, who's opened up a satellite office in our Student Center where students can register if they aren't already. They can choose to vote in Allendale if they want to switch their registration, or they can get assistance in getting a ballot from their home city or county in order to be able to participate in that way. And what I heard today was reassuring, and I hope that opens a door.
Great. Others of you want to jump in on that? Michelle or Polly, you work with college students as well. How can we foster these conversations when it seems like the conversations that they are seeing are not very good models for talking about these things? So talking about things like voting is one way to do it. Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Having been in the classroom in 2016 and kind of ever since, I think it's, the polarization has really affected the quality of the education that students are getting. I think the way after the 2016 election that most students dealt with this really sort of raw feeling after the election is they got quiet. I really noticed in my classes that students were much less willing to engage, much less willing to talk. I and my colleagues have really tried to address that head on and say, hey, don't be quiet. This is a place where we can model civil discourse, we can air disagreements, we can have constructive conversations. And, it helps a little bit to address that elephant in the room. But it's still hard. And I thought we had made some progress, but actually teaching in a largely online setting, I teach both online and in person, has made it worse again, because people are more willing to kind of be more extreme in their views when they're not face to face with each other. And I think that's a problem that I hope, will go away as we're able to transition to more in-person learning.
I'll just add one more thing, if you don't mind. In my view, when I teach about U.S. foreign policy, I think it really helps to be as specific as possible, not to talk in generalities about big problems or big people, but to say, what should be U.S. foreign policy toward Saudi Arabia? Today we had that conversation in class. And then you can talk about specific goals. How do the humanitarian goals coincide or contradict the economic goals? Talking about specific cases and specific historical events rather than kind of tossing out names and people and big ideas. I think being specific really helps. And also demanding that people, have sources and tell you the sources. I have students report the news and they're allowed to use commentary, but I have to hear where it's from. I need to know, what are we basing our comments on? And if you're going to write an opinion piece about something, please show me what sources you're using. So I think trying to keep it concrete really helps.
Yeah, and this is a kind of follow-up. We've seen a couple of questions come in about both social media and also the effects of the big tech companies on democracy. And maybe Pat could start us off with a little bit of that from his perspective of having worked in the Justice Department. What's the lay of the land in terms of big tech? And what can be done about the kind of polarization and echo chambers that we see develop on the social media platforms?
Social media platforms are of course meant to be the new town square where people can share their views. It's fairly unfiltered, and really it's an open marketplace of ideas. The problem is that, as you say, with an echo chamber, people, just like on cable news, will seek out those types of statements and views that reaffirm their pre-existing thoughts. And we've seen a lot of misinformation. You'll see, I've seen a lot of memes that people will circulate that attribute quotes to Thomas Jefferson that are a little too on point for today's environment, and and then you do just a 2-minute Google search, you find it's a completely fabricated quote from the 1980s. And so these types of things. So, they might need to start to do a better job of self-censoring, of having fact checkers that are, and I know because they're computer people, they want to use algorithms and computer programs to do the checking rather than actual people. But there does need to be some balance, or at least a huge disclaimer that these, without sourcing and even checking the sources, these things aren't necessarily true. But we need critical, and this goes to our education, panelists as well. We need critical thinkers in America. We need people who look at things critically and not just as an affirmation of their pre-existing beliefs. In addition, theoretically, you could see antitrust actions against some of the consolidation of the technology platforms. I'm very concerned, and have been for decades, about the reconsolidation of media outlets, where you have used to be, you couldn't own both the TV station, the radio station, and the newspaper in the same city, because then you could essentially have a monopoly on the press and the thinking that the public digests. something like that may have to come about again from an antitrust perspective and a legislative solution.
Yeah, great, thank you. Sticking with this theme of polarization and discourse, there's a question for Matt, which I think is interesting, and that is he seeing this on the local and state level as well? I mean, what's sort of the interaction between the polarization that's happening at the national level, which is pronounced? Is it replicated at the local and state levels as well, or is there a different dynamic happening there?
I think there is a carryover of the polarization into state legislative activities and the chambers. And it, in some respects, reflects what's happening nationally, and it also reflects what is happening in Michigan, which is, while it's one state, has different geography. And the lawmakers from the Upper Peninsula and the northern part of the state are different and have different agendas and items and constituents than folks from the urban centers. Plus, I think there's another dynamic going on in Michigan. For most of my adult lifetime, close elections in Michigan were settled on I-75, from Detroit north through Oakland County up to the big population centers of Flint, Saginaw, and Bay City. They've gotten smaller as auto world contracted and people have moved away. Those are smaller towns now, fewer voters once you get outside of Oakland County on 75, and the dynamic is switching now, I think, demonstrably to I-96. I don't know whether this is permanent, but it certainly happened in 2018. The 2 congressional seats that flipped from R to D, and 4 of the 5 state Senate seats that flipped from R to D were all located in or around I-96. So from Birmingham to East Lansing to East Grand Rapids to Norton Shores, voters, suburban voters, and particularly women, deserted the Republican Party and elected, that's where Gretchen Whitmer and Jocelyn Benson and Dana Nessel all got their margins of victory. We're off I-96. So I can't tell you that it's permanent, but I can tell you that it's a dynamic which also then has plays in Lansing legislatively.
Great, thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit and go to Michelle and ask her to maybe say a little bit more about these programs that she's talking about, potential college and workforce programs, in relationship to 2 different issues or populations. One is members of the military. Are these programs potential avenues for them as well to seek opportunities? And then I also wanted to see if you could somehow also address the issue of healthcare with that. You brought up the pandemic changing the nature of work, but it's also, of course, affecting healthcare. So maybe you could start and others can jump in on that.
Right. So the types of programs that I was talking about are really not directed specifically toward groups like veterans because they're place-based, right? And actually, veterans are in a pretty good shape when it comes to being able to afford college because they do have GI Bill benefits, and there are many programs for veterans. Grand Valley is considered a veteran-friendly institution. That designation has become more widespread in Michigan. One of the really sad effects of the pandemic has been the increase in enrollment in for-profit institutions. When institutions like Grand Valley or community colleges are facing declining enrollment and cutting costs, one of the things that goes is, robust marketing budgets. And I don't know if anyone else has noticed, there has been a real ramping up of really aggressive push advertising by for-profit institutions. I'm not a fan of for-profit institutions. The outcomes for students who attend those institutions are terrible. They solicit students who are Pell eligible, use their Pell grants, and have extremely low degree completion rates. Many of those students are veterans, and veterans needs to be really careful effort on the part of institutions like Grand Valley or GRCC to message to veterans that their money and their GI Bill and their Pell grants are going to be better, are going to yield better results at a public institution than a for-profit institution. Healthcare, I am not a healthcare policy expert, but I will say that since the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, we saw steady and substantial declines in the percentage of uninsured Americans without health insurance. And we all know if you're uninsured, a single illness can move you from the middle class into poverty pretty quickly. One of the really unfortunate features of 4 years of the Trump administration neglect at best and aggressive efforts to undermine the Affordable Care Act at worst, plus the pandemic, has led to an increase in the rate of uninsured Americans, and especially sad is the increase in the rate of uninsured children. So people have lost their jobs in the pandemic. Along with that, they've lost their health insurance. The outreach efforts that were part of the Affordable Care Act have been scaled back. And we're in a really perilous moment when it comes to the progress that was made in reducing the percentage of people who are uninsured. And if anybody else would like to weigh in on that healthcare issue, please feel free.
Thank you. I want to get us talking a little bit about the demonstrations that took place this summer, led by Black Lives Matters, and how you think that those are sort of playing into the current election cycle, what they mean for the Democratic Party for sure, Biden's chances perhaps, and what you see as might be the kind of long-term fruit of these fairly widespread movements, right, and demonstrations that we saw taking place even amidst a pandemic. So maybe we could get Pat to offer a few thoughts about that to start, and then some others.
It's very interesting because I was having a conversation with some friends about those, that the Black Lives Matter movement and the activism that we're seeing, especially among these young people, is not being led by the African American churches as a social movement, which that used to be the center of social activism in the civil rights movement and so forth. Instead, this is truly more grassroots. And even when I was U.S. Attorney, we talked about improving law enforcement and community relations. We obviously wanted to reach out to leaders in different colors of community and people of color who are leaders. And I made a point of we don't just need to reach out to the pastors of churches who have congregations in the hundreds. We also need to identify the people who are social media influencers who can reach thousands, even beyond the city limits that we're talking about. And so that is so true with these groups like Black Lives Matter and taking up those causes. And we've seen that, they are for, definitely for the most part, they're very peaceful. They're highlighting years of systematic racism and oppression, and just saying, look, we want to have Black Lives Matter as much as other races, not to go above, but just to at least get to that level in America, which is long overdue. And so from a political standpoint, we'll see if that type of activism translates into higher voter turnout and voter activism. I think people are also recognizing in those movements that their vote also matters and their voice matters at the ballot box. And so we'll see if that actually occurs on November 3rd.
So we've talked about polarization as a problem. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about the kind of legitimacy of elections that was described in the blurb for the panel, for the talk. And we've got some questions coming in about that, which I think are worth addressing as well. And so I'm going to pose this in two very different ways that will give other different panelists a chance to jump in. One is a kind of broad question that maybe Polly is best suited to answer, and that is, what can we learn from other countries? There's a contested election in Belarus right now, but around the world we've seen examples, throughout the 20th and 21st century of problems with legitimacy or problems with elections being viewed as illegitimate. So can we learn something from other countries? And then the other part of that might be for Pat or Matt, and that is the role of the courts. What role might the court end up playing in this election? And especially given the nomination of Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and it looks like that's going to go through next week. And so we'll return to 9 members on the court. How might that affect the outcome of the election? Polly, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I just want to say, I guess that first of all, we have a long history of smooth transitions, peaceful transitions from one president to the next. And I think that, while President Trump has changed a lot of the ways that we do things in foreign policy and in domestic policy, the way we talk and so forth, I just don't know if his impact is great enough to say, okay, now we're not even going to have a smooth transition to an election. So I'm a little bit less alarmed, I guess, than some people are about the potential that somehow this is going to end up in some, Belarus-like situation. I mean, they're a fairly young democracy. They're a very young country with only a few transitions under their belt. I feel as if in the United States, it'll be okay. And I think that there are elements, especially foreign elements, that are trying to sort of plant these seeds that there's a risk, that there's some big danger out there that the election may not go smoothly, or that it will be illegitimate, that the results won't be accurate, that the ballot boxes can be stolen. I mean, I think this is a narrative that's being suggested both by the president's campaign, but also I think with some frankly, illegitimate support from other, not that he's getting support from those countries, but those countries are also pushing this narrative forward. And it's I think we need to be careful to note that it probably isn't going to be that way, and that we have a long history of peaceful transition.
Pat is best able to talk about the court, so I'll leave that part of your question, Darren, for him. I have to say I'm baffled by the conversations surrounding absent ballots, absentee voting, and vote by mail. Let's take Kent County, for example. If there were going to be something nefarious going on, a majority of the clerks who conduct elections in Kent County are Republican. And I know a number of them. I've watched elections for years. I've been in rooms where, the ballots are counted and the machines were unloaded and so on and so forth. And they're very careful about what they do. It's a public trust, and they're extremely professional. I don't know how you pull off a fraud in that kind of a circumstance. It's a fascinating discussion, and I don't get it.
Well, as far as the courts go, I think we're seeing a couple potential scenarios coming out of this election that could potentially very damaging, again, to the institutions, the judicial institutions, American institutions, as I mentioned in my opening. First, we could see the Department of Justice begin investigations and challenges to state and local counts of ballots and thinking that there are irregularities there and casting doubt on the validity. We could see lawsuits about those same types of things. What is troubling to me is the potential now of such, again, a divisive political attitude where people are putting partisan interests ahead of the public interest. And that has infected some court decisions. This goes back to Bush v. Gore in 2000, where the majority, which was a conservative Republican appointed majority, took philosophically wrote an opinion that was opposed to the typical conservative limited government states' rights philosophy. And in fact, the opinion itself even said, don't use this opinion as case precedent. It's a one-time thing. And it was specifically to award, essentially, we know at the end of the day, to award the presidency to a Republican nominee for President George W. Bush. That was an overtly partisan opinion that was widely criticized and condemned by legal academics. And we have the potential for that type of a decision if this goes to the Supreme Court again, especially if Judge Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed and becomes the 9th justice that could potentially break a tie. And she's not said that she would recuse herself, even though the president has repeatedly said he's appointing her because he wants to have a decisive vote in the event the Supreme Court decides this election. This, again, is going to just, not only among Americans, but also in the world, cast a lot of doubt on the ways that our judicial institutions are functioning, that they're functioning fairly, that they're functioning on the rule of law. And again, I am, like I said, we are at a crossroads as a country. I am very, very troubled and concerned about that scenario occurring.
Yeah, thank you. So let's think about that term crossroads and think maybe past this election as a way maybe to close out this conversation. And that is, I want each of you to think about what we can do as citizens in the face of this crossroads, and how do we act as citizens in order to help reinvigorate democratic discourse in this country, and to continue to foster and protect strong democratic practices and strong democratic norms. So that's a lot, I know, I just threw at you, but it's come up in different ways in various questions that have been posted in the Q&A. So what are some concrete steps that citizens can take in order to help us move ahead, regardless of the outcomes of this particular election?
Study up on the candidates, vote, and especially vote in primary elections.
Okay, so starting off with the primary elections already, shaping the party in some ways that one is a member of. Yeah.
And there's a lot of action at the local level where there's maybe a little bit less polarization, but races that really matter, like school board races, well, obviously some of the judicial races are critically important. I mean, I would love to see a restoration of basic civility, and I would love to see things like public health measures like wearing masks be treated as public health measures and not points of political polarization. But how you get to that, I don't know. I think we're in a really, really tough spot to work our way back there. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we need to do a lot more to educate ourselves. I think we have been just too willing to be like receptors of information rather than looking for our information. And that means not just, tuning into a channel or a radio station or a website that feels comfortable to you, but going out and seeking good information. And I really mean that we need to be more likely to go look and to be able to take in lots of different information and think critically, as Pat Miles said a little bit earlier, not just sort of take what comes in or see what's kind of fun to hear about or fun to talk about. And I also agree with the idea about, not just tuning in every 4 years. There's a lot going on all the time. And it doesn't mean that that you can just kind of sit out for 3.5 years and then suddenly come back in and say, I like this guy or I like that woman. I think it's really more of a day-to-day thing. In terms of the dialogue and the conversations that we should be having, I guess I also feel like we need to return to some civility and to like trusting facts, like they're facts. We all have different opinions or different ideas, but like there are certain objective realities that we shouldn't make political because they aren't political things. I feel like especially things like, scientific discoveries and things that we have learned about how to stay safe from a virus. These are things that are objective realities that we shouldn't be politicizing.
Thank you, Pat.
I agree with that. I agree, also that, like Matt said, people need to vote. People need to be educated and look beyond, look into the candidates. When I ran for Congress in 2010, I ran against lockstep partisanship, and particularly in our elected officials. I also think that applies to our individual voters. I think everybody needs to just not have the knee-jerk reaction that just because a person of a different party is promoting a particular solution, that it's automatically bad. We've seen a lot of people propose things that are rejected out of hand that they themselves used to promote. For example, the Affordable Care Act, I just can't say this enough, was the reason the Republicans can't come up with a healthcare plan for repeal and replace is because the Affordable Care Act is their plan. It is from the 90s. It came out of the Heritage Foundation. Senate Republicans wanted a corporate mandate. That was rejected, and so Senate Republicans said instead of having a corporate mandate, we'll have an individual, mandate. So this just because President Obama proposed the Affordable Care Act as a middle ground solution, rather than going for universal health care, expanding Medicare for all, he went for the middle ground, adopting the Republican plan, and was hopeful that would achieve consensus. Instead, not a single Republican in Congress or the Senate voted for the Affordable Care Act, even though it was their proposal. It's a market-based solution. So that's just the biggest example in my mind of just lockstep partisanship for no other reason, not for good policy, but just for pure partisan points to try and defeat the opposition just because they're the opposition. That's not good for public policy.
And I think citizens of all stripes are very frustrated with that. So, that's why it's one of the questions is, well, what do we do as citizens then? And part of that is, of course, what Matt said, and that is you have to demand different leadership in your parties, and you do that through local organizing and primaries and so forth. I would just add myself that I think one of the things we need to do is to get to know each other. We have to break out of our bubbles, and that has to be intentional because otherwise it's just easy to fall into only surrounding yourself with people already agree with you, and it's now hard to get outside of that, and so it requires actual effort, I think. Michelle wanted to get in here as well.
I just want to mention there's a very interesting op-ed in the New York Times this morning by two political scientists who argued that the real divide is not between left and right or Democrat and Republican. It's between the 15% of people who are very, very attentive to politics and the 85% who are largely tuned out. And I would say we have some definite sampling bias here because probably all of us are in that 15%. But it was kind of a shocking statistic, and it was based in some pretty decent research. I guess I've been really encouraged dealing with students over the past year at how engaged they are. I don't think I have ever asked a classroom of students before through an anonymous poll whether they were registered to vote and gotten like a 100% yes, we are in 20 plus years of teaching. So I am really encouraged, and I guess that's something we have something to thank the Trump administration for. It has gotten people a lot more attentive, and that data, Matt, that you showed at the beginning about the number of people who sat out or who voted for a third party, people were complacent and they didn't necessarily get what they wanted, and so it was a wake-up call.
Great. Well, on that hopeful note, I will bring this conversation to a close. Before I turn it over to Jacob, I just want to thank our panelists again. I really appreciated hearing your thoughts and being able to engage with you. And I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you very much. Jacob.
Well, yep.
Thank you, Darren.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to our moderator and all of our panelists this evening. And please mark your calendars for our next event on Thursday, November 12th at 7 p.m. when Ari Weinsvig, co-founder of Zingerman's Deli, joins our cohort of fellow candidates for a wheelhouse talk on the power of beliefs in business. After this meeting ends, a link will pop up with a survey about this evening's event. I encourage you to fill that out and let us know what you thought of tonight's event, and also give us some feedback for future events as well. Once again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and enjoy the rest of your night.